For blood test number 5 in 2024, when using Dr. Morgan Levine's biological age calculator, PhenoAge, we saw that my biological age was 17.6 years younger than the chronological. So what might be contributing to these data? In the last video, we covered supplements, and if you missed that, I'll put the video link in the right corner. But what about diet? More specifically, what diet composition corresponds to blood test number 5? So for now, we're going to take a look at average daily dietary intake. This is from May 28th, that's immediately after blood test number 4, through July 25th, that's the day before blood test number 5. And that period is 59 days. So immediately after the last test through the day before the next test, that 59-day period, I take the average daily intake, average dietary intake, as I weigh all of my food. So the full list is shown here. So I ate 54 different foods for this period, and this list is ranked in grams from highest to lowest, with the exception of coffee. I had one 20-ounce coffee. This isn't anything from Starbucks or anything crazy like that, just black, made it home, brewed myself. So that's in ounces, and also green tea is in ounces. And if you want to use what I use, there's a discount link for organic loose leaf green tea in the video's description. All right, so what about experiments for this test? So the goal is to always improve, to optimize all of the biomarkers simultaneously, not just focus on a few. So to do that, I run several experiments and then calculate correlations after each test. So what experiments did I do? So the most important one potentially was reducing mushroom intake from an average of 250 grams per day for test number 4 to 95 grams per day for test number 5. So why did I do that experiment? Mushrooms are a rich source of ergothioneine, spermidine, which extends lifespan in mice. So why would I cut mushroom intake? Well, mushrooms contain niacin, but as nicotinamide or nicotinic acid. And I raised that question because if it's nicotinic acid, I'd expect my NAD levels to be higher than they usually are, as they generally track on the low side, or age expected, which is a dirty word in my approach, age expected being a dirty word. So that they're not relatively high with high dose mushrooms, which are rich in niacin. That suggests that mushrooms contain a lot of nicotinamide. And that's potentially important because, as we'll see in the next video, nicotinamide increases plasma levels of homocysteine a lot more than nicotinic acid. So I did the experiment that maybe having mushroom intake a bit too high may be contributing to my age expected values or current values for homocysteine. So did that work? Stay tuned for the next video for that data and the story. I also added broccoli sprouts into the approach, so I grew them myself at home and then reintroduced broccoli into the approach. As for test number 4, I cut it out for most of that period. And I did that because both broccoli sprouts and broccoli are rich sources of sulforaphane, which can reduce oxidative stress. Oxidative stress can limit telomere length, and knowing that my telomere length has also been trending on the lower side for the past few tests, I want to reverse that trend and try to get it as close to youthful values as possible. Telomere tests aren't yet in. Those results are expected in the next week or so. So stay tuned for a video update for whether any of these changes impacted telomere length in an upcoming video. Now also note that to maximize sulforaphane content, which is lost in cooking, so I added the broccoli sprouts to a cooked mix after it was done cooking, but still the temperature of that mix is 212 F or 100 Celsius. So it's possible that there was some degradation of sulforaphane induced by heat. So to help minimize that, I added mustard powder. And in terms of how much mustard powder to add to cook broccoli or when eating broccoli sprouts, I'll post that in a relatively short video coming up in the near future. I also reduced coconut butter and cacao beans, as these are my 2 primary sources of saturated fat in the diet, and I did that following the correlations with an older epigenetic age using the Horvath test, which is the best epigenetic clock for asking, how old are you? What's your birthday? So in my data, total fat and a relatively higher saturated fatty acid intake are significantly correlated with an older Horvath epigenetic age. So to test that correlation, if I cut saturated fat and if I cut total fat, I should see an improvement if correlation equals causation. I don't know if that's true. I have to do the experiment. So for this test, I cut the 2 primary sources of saturated fat in my diet, coconut butter and cacao beans. I also added kimchi into the approach as it's fermented cabbage. And I did that because fermented foods, including kimchi, contain certain lactobacillus species, which have been shown in both animal models and human randomized controlled trials to have a positive impact on the gut muscle axis. In other words, improving muscle mass and function with specific lactobacillus species isolated from fermented cabbage. If you missed that video, it'll be in the right corner. Now, in terms of dose in people, completely unknown. I have no idea how high to go, but I figure at least having some may be better than none. So kimchi will be in and out of the approach at relatively low amounts for future videos, future diet composition videos. I also increased Brazil nuts to close to their highest intake since I started tracking diet in 2015. And I did that exclusively for their selenium content, as I was trying to make a positive impact on the free T3 to free T4 ratio. These are thyroid hormones. So that ratio declines during aging. Selenium is a required cofactor for converting T4 into T3. So I tested the hypothesis that if I increase selenium intake, I could increase that conversion of T4 into T3 and improve the free T3 to free T4 ratio. Unfortunately, it didn't make a dent, increasing selenium intake from about 260 up to 400 micrograms per day. Didn't make a dent on either free T3 or free T4, as they were exactly the same at both the lower and higher selenium intakes. So for the next test, I've reduced Brazil nut intake back to where it was prior to these changes. So around 7 to 8 grams per day relative to 14 grams per day. I also increased sardines, and this is about a 45 gram per day increase relative to the last test. And I did that because sardines have a +6 net correlative score with a panel of 25 clinical chemistry biomarkers that I track for every test and that I calculate correlations on. And that doesn't include correlations with epigenetics or metabolomics. So that strong net positive correlative score suggests that if I eat towards the higher end of my intake range for sardines, that should have a positive effect on more biomarkers in terms of aging and all-cause mortality risk. Now, increasing sardines for this test didn't make a dent on PhenoAge, as it was almost exactly the same test over test, number 4 versus number 5. And almost all of the other biomarkers didn't change, with the exception of blood urea nitrogen going up by a bit and uric acid going up by a bit. And that's not a surprise, as higher protein intake, probably more of that converted into bun. And sardines are a meat source, so they probably have a high purine content, which can be converted into uric acid. Nonetheless, it didn't make a big dent on at least the clinical chemistry biomarkers. So for now, I've cut them back down to where they were for test number 4. And that story will be more in the next video when we talk about mushrooms and homocysteine and nicotinamide. All right, so what about other aspects of the diet, including cheat meals? So the diet isn't always purposefully clean. And I do that because if I try to go completely cold turkey, no junk ever, I get to a point where I start thinking about junk food, and that can increase the risk for a binge. And I'm trying to avoid any excess eating over the calorie goals that I set every day, trying to be mild CR for as long as I physically can. So with that in mind, I include a couple of cheat meals for at least 2 days out of every dietary period. So for this test, it was no-bake cheesecake, the kind of stuff, you can buy it at the store in a container already pre-made, and mixed in 2 separate containers on day 1. Raspberry jam on the first day, or actually raspberry jam and caramel sauce, 2 separate containers. And then I decided which one I liked better and had the raspberry jam mixed with cheesecake on the second day. So that's only 2 days of junk. And then after that, I shut it off. 57 days afterwards, completely clean, no junk at all. In terms of the calories that were provided from the junk from these 3 foods, about 1,600 from cheesecake, about 600 from raspberry jam, and about 315 from the caramel sauce. Together, they add up to a little bit more than 2,500 calories, and when divided by total calorie intake for this 59-day period, it's 2% of total calories, so the diet was 98% clean. Now, for other tests, it's been 99% clean. So what these data suggest is that whether it's 99 or 98% clean, that doesn't seem to have a big impact on at least PhenoAge and the clinical chemistry biomarkers. I'm analyzing the metabolomic data now, and the epigenetics aren't yet in. There may be some changes there, but we'll have to see how that plays out. So the big question is, how clean does the diet have to be to have one's most youthful data, right? I'm not against fun foods, right? And enjoying my diet, which I generally do. But is it 95%? And I'm not trying to do that experiment. I think 1 to 2% for me is the lowest limit. I'm not trying to mess around with how clean or not. Others can do that experiment, but for me, this is what works. All right, so this list is ranked in grams. Which foods are the top contributors in terms of calories? And that's what we'll see here with the top 10 foods. And this list is generated by Chronometer. If you want to track your own diet using Chronometer, there's a discount link in the video's description. So the top contributor for calories, as it has been for many tests, is sardine. So apologies to the vegans, but this is just what works for me. In terms of the other foods on the list, 9 of the 10 foods that are on this list were also in the top 10 list for test number 4. At this point, the goal is not to blow up the system. It's to keep biomarkers that are already mostly youthful, as evidenced by PhenoAge and a few others: blood pressure, lung function, etc., strength, body composition. I'm not trying to blow up the system. I'm trying to make small changes to improve weak spots like homocysteine, Horvath's epigenetic age, increase DHEA sulfate by a bit, increase telomere length back to youthful levels, but without blowing up the rest of the system. So you can see for 9 of the 10 foods that were on this test in the top 10 for calories, they were also in the top 10 for test number 4. All right, so what about macronutrients? So first, starting off with calorie intake, the average daily calorie intake for the 59-day period that corresponds to this test was 2,162 calories. Now, this is the second test in a row since 2021 where calorie intake was not sequentially lower. So for 21 consecutive tests over the past 3 years, I cut calories by a small amount for every test, very small amount, not 500 calories per day, not 200 calories per day. For me, cutting calories too fast and losing weight/fat too quickly has led to a rebound gain. And I was trying to avoid that as much as possible. So that's why I made very small calorie cuts over a very long period of time. Now, 2 tests ago, I stopped that. And I increased the average calorie intake for test number 4 by about 40 calories per day. And I did that because I started to see a strength decrement for things like pull-ups and the overhead shoulder press. Now, the goal is to be as lean as, at least my goal, is to be as lean as possible without any deficit in strength. I don't care if I'm 160 pounds or 140, 141 pounds. I don't want to lose an ounce of strength regardless of which body weight that I'm at. So I started to see a strength decrement, so I added calories by a little bit for the last test. For this test, I increased to a little bit more. So now I'm about 100 calories higher than I was 2 tests ago at 2162. And I have no plans to change the calorie intake going forward. I'm going to stay at this calorie level as strength has somewhat come back. So I don't know if that's because of calories or because of I've increased NAD by a little bit. Both of those may be involved, but those are stories for another day. In terms of average daily protein intake for this test, 112 grams per day, which is 21% of total calories. In terms of fat intake, 83 grams per day, which is about 35% of total calories. And then for comparison, let's bring up test number 4. So you can see that the major cut was first total fat from about 93 to 83 grams per day. So 10 gram per day cut with the goal of improving the Horvath epigenetic age. In terms of where that fat cut came from, you can see that it was from saturated fat at about 8 grams per day. Now, also note that I didn't change omega-3 and omega-6 as they were 9.6 and 16 grams for this test and in the same ballpark for test number 4. So again, trying to keep other aspects of the diet stable while making specific cuts or reductions or increases to other areas, but very specific cuts while not blowing up the rest of the system. There was a small decrease for monounsaturated fat, but as you can see, the biggest cut was to saturated fat intake. Again, for Horvath, trying to test that correlation. All right, next up, carb intake. So total carbs were 281 grams per day, which I say a lot. That may seem like a lot, but net carbs equals total carbs minus fiber. Average daily fiber intake for this test was 88 grams per day. So when subtracting that from total carbs, we get a net carbs of 193 grams per day. We'll multiply by 4 calories per gram, and then dividing that by calorie intake multiplied by 100. Net carbs that correspond to this test was 36%. Now note that fiber also contributes calories to the diet, and that's because fiber is comprised of insoluble and soluble fiber. The soluble fiber is converted by gut bacteria into short-chain fatty acids. In other words, a fraction of fiber, about 20%, is converted into fats. So about that 20% equates to about 188 calories, or 9% of the diet coming from fiber being converted into fat. So I can add that to total fat and then we can calculate net macros, which for this test were 43% total fat, 36% net carbs, and 21% protein. Now, within total carbs, I also pay attention to sugar intake. But more specifically, there's a big wide net for sugars. But more specifically, I track total fructose intake because the diet is rich in fruits and vegetables, especially fruits and vegetables that are rich in fructose. And in my data, total fructose is significantly correlated with more biomarkers going in the wrong direction than right. So I have to make sure that it's towards the lower end of my range to try to minimize any adverse effects of too much fructose on blood biomarkers. So for this test, when taking the sum of fructose plus half of sucrose, because sucrose is fructose bound to glucose, so half of sucrose is fructose. When summing them together, I get a total fructose for this test of 56.5 grams per day, which may seem like a lot, but that's close to my lowest of 56.2 grams per day. And I've been able to make another fructose cut, so expect to see fructose being a bit lower than 56.2, my lowest ever, for test number 6, which is scheduled for around 2 weeks from today. All right, what about micronutrients? So the full list of vitamins as shown here. And for anyone starting on this journey, I always recommend covering the RDAs. Now, how high you should go above the RDAs is very debatable and probably very individual. What works for me may not work for others in terms of how high or not to go for specific vitamins and minerals. Just to highlight a couple, in terms of full RDA coverage, it looks like choline is not above the RDA, but unfortunately Chronometer doesn't have choline data for sardines. When adding the choline from sardines, I cover the RDA there. And also for vitamin D, that looks like that's not meeting the RDA, but as we saw in the last video, infrequent vitamin D supplementation plus infrequent sun exposure, and I'd love to get more sun exposures. There just isn't too many cloudy days and rainy days in Boston in the summer, unfortunately. But we saw in the last video that even with infrequent vitamin D and infrequent sun exposure, circulating levels of vitamin D were 38 nanograms per mil, which is associated with lowest risk of death for all causes, so all good there. Many other micronutrients are purposely much higher than the RDA, and that's because I'm following correlations with blood and other biomarkers, including blood pressure. And if you're interested in that data, it's on the correlations tier on Patreon, so check it out. For comparison, let's bring up test number 4 and highlight niacin. So for this test, I purposely raised it a bit higher to around 71 milligrams per day, the majority of that coming from nicotinic acid, with the goal of increasing NAD. And you can see for test number 4, it was 42 milligrams per day. And rather than just assuming that those levels can have a positive impact or not on NAD, I measured it. And on the day of testing for test number 5, it was around 28 micromolar in conjunction with that 71 milligrams of nicotinic acid per day. But for test number 4, with a lower niacin nicotinic acid intake, we can see that NAD was on the lower side. And that's probably my lowest limit for NAD. That's where I started to see strength decrements. So the goal is to keep it NAD away from 20 micromolar and keep it closer to 30. And that's the goal for the next test, to increase nicotinic acid and total niacin to around 80 milligrams per day. That might not seem like a big jump, but the goal is small, progress. Now, I'm not trying to blow up the system, but make small targeted changes. All right, what about minerals? So we can see that listed here for test number 5, and then bringing up test number 4 for comparison. So first we can see that calcium intake was about 100 milligrams higher, and I did that on purpose because I increased collard green intake. Collard greens are a low oxalate containing vegetable that are rich in calcium, and because they're low in oxalate, and because I'm increasing calcium intake, when considering that calcium binds to oxalate and then it's excreted, that limits how much oxalate is absorbed. So the goal was to increase calcium by a little bit, more relative to the last test, so I could potentially further reduce oxalate absorption and then maybe see if any biomarkers changed as a result of that. All right, also note that copper, it was 1 milligram lower, which may not seem like a lot relative to test number 4, but that's a 25% decrease. And also zinc was a little bit lower too. Both of those are related to decreasing mushroom intake and decreasing cacao beans, which are my 2 major sources of copper and zinc. And then also we can see selenium. I increased that to the tolerable upper limit, and that's not from supplementation. That's just from diet with the Brazil nuts and other foods like sardines, which are selenium rich. You can see that for this test, it was around 400 milligrams per day, and that was a further increase relative to test number 4, but again, no impact on thyroid hormone markers like free T3 and free T4. All right, that's all for now. If you're interested in more of my attempts to biohack aging, check us out on Patreon, where besides posting daily the diet updates every couple of months after a blood test, I post diet data every day, so you get to see the day-to-day struggle for how I'm running the show or how I'm running the approach. But then I also have biomarker correlations on Patreon. So after every test, I calculate correlations for diet, macros and micros with at least 25 standard clinical chemistry biomarkers. So if you're interested in that, check it out. But I also have been posting full metabolomic and epigenetic correlations there too. So it's a lot more than just 25 biomarkers and their correlations with diet. I also post daily data for heart rate variability, resting heart rate, sleep stages, and then if you want to check out early videos before they're posted on YouTube and ad-free, and I also provide blood test consults. So if any of that interests you, check it out. We've also got a bunch of discount links and affiliates that you can use to test yourself while also helping to support the channel, including Ulta Labs, epigenetic testing, NAD quantification, oral microbiome composition, at-home metabolomics, at-home blood testing with Cyfox Health, which includes ApoB, but also GrimAge, green tea, diet tracking with Chronometer, or if you'd like to support the channel, you can do that with the website, Buy Me a Coffee. We've also got merch, so if you're interested in wearing the ConquerAging or Diet Trying brand, as I've got on here, that link and all of the other links will be in the video's description. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Have a great day.